When Rosie O'Donnell mocked Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's prestigious law degree and belittled her 15 years of legal experience on live TV, she thought she could effortlessly tear down a rising political star with a few condescending words. But in less than 90 seconds, Jasmine didn't just defend herself, she completely obliterated Rosie's attack. What followed was a masterclass in composure and intellect, as Jasmine turned Rosie's arrogance into a public spectacle, exposing her own ignorance for the world to see. What exactly did Jasmine say that made Rosie's own mockery unravel her career in front of a national audience? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The lights above Studio 4B buzzed with anxious energy as producers paced behind the velvet curtains. Mic checks echoed through hidden earpieces, and the iconic logo of The View shimmered on the floor like a warning. Today's segment was marketed as a generational dialogue between powerful women, a polished tagline meant to hide the real bait: tension, controversy, and ratings. Jasmine Crockett, the freshman congresswoman from Texas, had been invited under the impression this was a good-faith conversation about criminal justice reform. Her team had even prepared policy handouts and pre-cleared talking points. But elsewhere in the building, in a private dressing room lined with awards and ego, Rosie O'Donnell smirked while sipping black coffee from a cracked Queen of Talk mug. "We're really putting a kid on the air for this?" she scoffed. "What did she go to? Some community college law program?" A junior producer laughed nervously, unsure whether to correct her or just survive the next hour. Rosie waved her off and leaned back, eyes half-lidded with boredom and something colder: contempt. Backstage, Jasmine stood motionless as a sound technician clipped a mic to her collar, unaware that a storm had been engineered specifically for her. She wore a tailored navy suit, sharp shoulders, clean lines, zero fear. Her notes were organized by topic, color-coded, and clipped to a leather folio with the House Judiciary Committee seal embossed in gold. The studio air smelled of overworked lighting and fresh hairspray, but the tension was something else: static, invisible, real. Producers muttered into walkie-talkies with phrases like, "Just let Rosie go," and "She'll light it up." In the control room, one executive whispered, "Watch the younger one. If she holds, we've got viral gold." The stage was set, but not for dialogue. It was a trap dressed as television, a collision of eras, egos, and ideologies. Jasmine Crockett was being led toward a rigged arena, and she didn't even know the first shot had already been fired. Backstage. She didn't know it yet. The moment Jasmine Crockett stepped into the studio spotlight, the rules had already been rewritten behind her back, and the air itself felt rigged against her. The music cue hit like a countdown to detonation, and Rosie O'Donnell strutted onto the stage with a swagger that reeked of old-world entitlement. She didn't just sit. She claimed her seat, adjusted her mic like a general about to declare war, and tossed a quick glance at the camera as if the nation should be grateful for her presence. Her lips curled into a half smirk when she finally turned toward her guest, a woman young enough to be her daughter, but composed enough to make her blink. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, posture tall, expression unreadable, palms folded like steel wrapped in velvet. She was everything Rosie was not: young, focused, rising, and worst of all for someone like Rosie, unimpressed. Jasmine didn't fidget. She didn't smile. She didn't play to the cameras. That unnerved Rosie more than she let on. Behind them, the co-hosts exchanged glances, tight, restrained, uneasy. The audience sensed something too. Not entertainment, but an ambush. Something was about to explode, and everyone except Jasmine seemed to know it. And in the control booth above, the director barked camera angles like battlefield orders. "Camera 3 on Rosie, tight shot. Camera 1, hold on Jasmine, do not miss her face." Rosie cracked her knuckles theatrically, a gesture that might have seemed cute if it weren't so venomous. Jasmine's eyes, calm and steady, didn't flinch. She wasn't just under the lights, she was walking into fire, and still she refused to burn. And as Rosie lounged into her seat with the smugness of someone expecting a lightweight opponent, Jasmine Crockett did the opposite. She straightened her spine, adjusted her mic, and made the studio feel like a courtroom. The moment was heavy, but not with nerves, with intent. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She didn't warm up. She opened with a statement so direct it sliced through the glossy set like a blade. The Criminal Justice Reform Act of 2024 is not a theory, it's a response, a necessary one. Because what we're dealing with is not just a legal failure, it's a moral collapse. Her tone was calm, but beneath it was steel. The act, she explained, was designed to target three pillars of dysfunction: sentencing disparities, broken rehabilitation systems, and judicial accountability. But she didn't drown the room in dry policy speak. Instead, she painted it in human suffering. She described how a black teenager in Houston received 15 years for possession of a small bag of marijuana, while a white college student in the same jurisdiction was diverted into rehab. She spoke of a single mother who lost her home because she had to choose between paying rent and bailing her son out for an offense the judge himself admitted was minor. And her voice didn't crack when she said it, but the air in the studio did. She turned statistics into weapons. Black defendants are 19% more likely to be sentenced to prison than white defendants for the same crime. 20% longer sentences on average. That's not anecdotal. That's the U.S. Sentencing Commission. Her hand didn't shake as she held up a printout of the data, but Rosie shifted beside her, arms now folded, eyes narrowing. Jasmine noticed but didn't acknowledge her. Her target wasn't Rosie. Her target was the machine Rosie never had to fight, the one that chewed up her constituents every day and spit them out with numbers, not names. Her tone tightened, her words sharpened. In 2023, over 800,000 people sat in jail cells, not because they were guilty, but because they were poor. She let that sentence hang, let it sting. Then she continued, "We've built a system where wealth buys freedom and poverty gets a court date. If you're lucky." She cited a case where a man spent 14 months in pretrial detention for stealing a jacket because he couldn't afford $2,500 in bail. By the time he was released, so she said, he had lost his job, his housing, and custody of his daughter. The audience grew utterly silent, not out of confusion, but out of reckoning. She wasn't speaking at them. She was speaking for someone they'd never met, but suddenly felt they knew. And the brilliance wasn't just in the content, it was in the delivery. Jasmine translated institutional injustice into intimate tragedy without raising her voice, without moving an inch in her chair. She didn't perform. She prosecuted. And still, she made room for hope. This bill mandates mandatory review of sentencing outcomes by race and income. It diverts nonviolent offenders into job training programs instead of cages. It holds judges publicly accountable for disparities in rulings. We're not asking for favors. We're demanding balance. Then she looked up directly into the camera as if to say, if you're watching this, silence is complicity. That one glance held more gravity than any applause line could. And the audience, both in the studio and across the country, felt it. That this wasn't just a segment. It was testimony. From a woman who had clawed her way through law school, through courtrooms, through bias and smirks and ceilings made of something thicker than glass. And now here she was, naming the system for what it was, publicly, unapologetically, on a national stage built for personalities, not principles. She was young, yes, but no one watching could claim she wasn't ready. She had turned a conversation into a cross-examination. And the real question now wasn't whether Jasmine Crockett had made her case. It was whether anyone dared try to refute it. And just as Jasmine Crockett finished laying out the final point of her proposal, calm, clear, and devastatingly precise, Rosie O'Donnell shifted in her chair like someone preparing to swat a fly she found irritating rather than worthy. The applause hadn't even died down when Rosie cut through it with a voice coated in sugar but sharpened like a knife. "Sweetheart," she said, drawing the word out as if she were addressing a misbehaving intern, not a sitting member of Congress. "Do you really think the average viewer understands what you're saying? All these legal terms, sentencing disparities, judicial accountability, it's starting to sound more like a dissertation than something for television." She gave a performative laugh, shallow and condescending, and let her eyes scan the audience as if searching for validation. Then came the second jab, more direct. "Maybe you should try explaining it the way you would to your clients. You know, the ones who couldn't afford real lawyers." The room tightened. You could feel it, the way a storm tightens the air before the first strike. Several audience members exchanged glances, unsure whether they'd heard what they just heard, or whether Rosie had really just suggested that Jasmine's legal background was second-rate. But Rosie wasn't finished. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, as if she were letting Jasmine in on a secret the rest of the world already knew. "Not everything has to be a Harvard lecture, honey," she added, her voice curling around the word Harvard like it tasted bitter. "Sometimes the grown-ups in the room just want plain talk." That word, grown-ups, hung like a guillotine in the air, and Jasmine still hadn't spoken. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her hands remained folded neatly in her lap, and her eyes never left Rosie's. But the insult had landed, not because Jasmine didn't expect it, but because Rosie had made it clear this wasn't going to be a debate. This was going to be a dismantling disguised as dialogue. Rosie wasn't challenging the bill. She was challenging Jasmine's right to speak about it at all. Her intelligence, her education, her identity. This wasn't policy disagreement. It was intellectual profiling dressed up as banter. The studio lights may have been set to warm, but the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. Rosie had thrown the first punch, and she thought it was a knockout. But Jasmine? Jasmine was just letting the moment load, and as the final traces of Rosie's smirk hung in the air, like the stench of something rotten, Jasmine Crockett exhaled. Not out of fatigue, but from the kind of deep patience that only women who've spent their lives being underestimated learn to master. She didn't fire back. She didn't interrupt. She simply straightened the edge of her blazer with the same deliberate calm a surgeon might show before making the first incision. Then, with a voice so steady it seemed carved from marble, she began, not to defend herself, but to remind the room exactly who they were speaking to. "I've practiced law for 15 years, she said evenly, her eyes never leaving Rosie's. "I began in the public defender's office, representing people the system forgot, because someone had to. I served in the Texas House of Representatives, where I authored and passed legislation reforming bail procedures and expanding access to legal aid. And today," she continued, her tone sharpening like a scalpel, "I serve on the House Judiciary Committee, where I help shape national policy on the exact issues you just mocked." Each word was placed with surgical precision, not as a shield, but as a mirror. One that forced Rosie, and everyone else watching, to confront the ugly undercurrent beneath her condescension. But Rosie, either unwilling or incapable of hearing what had just been said, shook her head slowly, lips pursed, eyes squinting like she was watching someone attempt a magic trick she didn't believe in. Her body language didn't just question Jasmine's credentials, it dismissed them outright, as if to say, "You can list every title you want, but it still doesn't count coming from you." It wasn't just doubt, it was disbelief, rooted not in reason but in reflex. That deep, cultural reflex that hears Harvard law from a black woman and silently wonders, affirmative action? That sees 15 years in courtrooms and still thinks, "But how sharp can she really be?" Jasmine noticed. Of course she did. You don't spend your life earning your way into rooms like this one without learning how to read the subtle mechanics of disbelief. And in that moment, something changed, not in her voice, which remained composed, or her posture, which stayed firm, but in her eyes. A flicker, a recalibration. She wasn't angry. She was precise. Rosie had made a mistake, one Jasmine had seen many times before. Not by disagreeing, but by assuming superiority, by mistaking celebrity for credibility, by assuming that a television legacy gave her license to question legal authority. And Jasmine wasn't going to shout or cry or storm off. She would dismantle Rosie's assumptions with the one thing her opponent couldn't fake: earned knowledge, delivered without fear. But still, Jasmine kept her tone soft. That perhaps was the most devastating part. She had every right to snap, every right to strike, and yet she remained calm. Because this wasn't the first time she'd been told she didn't belong. It was just the first time someone had said it on live television. And Rosie O'Donnell, without even realizing it, had just lit the match that would turn this segment from a talk show into a masterclass in controlled destruction. And just as Jasmine's poised, Professional response began to shift the balance in the room. Subtly, powerfully, Rosie O'Donnell leaned back in her chair with the smug confidence of someone mistaking applause for authority. The tension was no longer subtle. It rippled beneath the polished surface of the studio like a tremor, building towards something catastrophic. Rosie seemed oblivious, or worse, emboldened, by the silence that followed Jasmine's calm. Her lips curled into a smirk, her eyes narrowing with the entitlement of someone who had never had to earn her voice. Then she struck. "Listen," she said with a breathy chuckle that disguised nothing. "I've been in politics longer than you've been able to walk." She didn't even face Jasmine when she said it. She aimed the line over her shoulder, toward the cameras, toward the audience, as if inviting them to laugh along. But the laugh never came. The insult wasn't just a cheap shot, it was an erasure. And Rosie wasn't finished. Her voice sharpened, each word honed with the bitterness of someone who couldn't stomach being challenged by someone younger, smarter, and unshaken. "Those little law classes you took," she sneered, "they don't prepare you for how the real world works. Out here it's not about theory, it's about instinct, experience, something you don't have." The word little hung like acid in the air. Then came the final strike, delivered with the practiced cruelty of someone who'd spent decades perfecting how to silence people without raising her voice. "Politics is about instinct, sweetheart, not lectures. Maybe stick to what you know, whatever that is." Sweetheart, she said it like a hammer, not a hug, like the leash she thought would snap Jasmine back into place. The word rang out, not affectionate, not ironic, but surgical, deliberate, designed to degrade. And then, nothing, no sound, no reaction, just stillness. The air seemed to shrink. The bright stage lights, once warm, now felt cold and exposing. The studio didn't gasp, it recoiled. One could hear shifting seats, few sharp inhales, the subtle buzz of equipment suddenly amplified by the absence of any other sound. Rosie hadn't sparked debate. She had detonated a moment. What just happened wasn't political sparring. It was an attempted public dismantling, a humiliation. But Jasmine Crockett did not move. She didn't blink. She didn't even lean back. She sat exactly as she had before, composed, centered, coiled. Her silence was not confusion. It was strategy. Her expression was unreadable to most. But to those who'd ever been spoken down to, underestimated, called sweetheart as a weapon, it was crystal clear. She wasn't waiting to respond. She was choosing how. Rosie hadn't ended the conversation. She'd opened a portal, and Jasmine was no longer debating. She was preparing to bury her. And as Rosie's final word, sweetheart, fell with a thud against the studio floor, the atmosphere cracked open, not with noise, but with silence so dense it felt weaponized. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink, didn't tilt her head, didn't even tighten her jaw. For 3 long seconds, she sat there in absolute stillness, unmoving, unreadable. But her silence wasn't shock. It wasn't submission. It was calculation, the kind that doesn't announce itself but coils beneath the surface like a current preparing to strike. Her spine remained perfectly aligned with the back of her chair, her hands still calmly folded. But her eyes, they shifted, not with panic, with precision. They moved across the table, slow and deliberate, locking onto Rosie like a targeting system coming online. Those who had seen Jasmine work in congressional hearings, the way she dismantled hostile witnesses, exposed contradictions buried under layers of deflection, recognized that look instantly. It wasn't anger. It wasn't insult. It was focus. Jasmine had entered a different mode now, one that wasn't visible to most, but unmistakable to anyone who's ever stood in the presence of righteous control. Her gaze didn't just settle on Rosie, it studied her, measured her, not emotionally, but structurally, as if identifying every soft point in her argument, every vulnerable seam in her arrogance, every fact she had ignored in favor of condescension. The silence stretched just long enough for the discomfort to begin growing in the audience's chest. And still Jasmine said nothing. Because this wasn't a delay, it was an assessment. Decision not to react emotionally, but to dismantle methodically. She wasn't frozen. She was calibrating. And beneath the glare of studio lights and the hum of broadcast satellites, a truth pulsed so quietly it was almost invisible. Rosie had no idea what she had just done. She hadn't insulted Jasmine. She had activated her. And after that silence, measured, loaded, and surgical, Jasmine finally leaned forward, but not in retreat. It was the quiet shift of someone stepping fully into control, like a litigator rising from the bench, not to speak louder, but to make it clear that every word about to be spoken would be irrevocable. She began not with fury, but with fact. "Let me clarify, since my background seems to be in question," she said, her voice composed, deliberate. "I graduated summa cum laude from Rhodes College with a degree in business administration. I went on to earn my Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School. Not a summer workshop, not a celebrity panel. Harvard. Law." Her words weren't sharp by volume, they were sharp by aim. She wasn't reciting a resume. She was reclaiming narrative space that Rosie had tried to steal with smirks and sarcasm. But Jasmine didn't stop at titles. She knew that degrees alone were never enough, not for people like her. "While some people built their careers talking over others," she continued, "I spent mine representing the voiceless. Public defense isn't glamorous. It doesn't come with spotlights or studio lights. It comes with 3 a.m. jail calls and clients who know the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed." Her voice lowered, not from uncertainty, but from depth. She wasn't trying to win a round. She was opening a wound, one the system refused to acknowledge. "I've sat with mothers whose sons were handed plea deals instead of justice. I've read police reports that didn't need edits. They needed indictments. That's what those little law school classes taught me. Not just theory, battle, every single day." Her tone was not aggressive, but unflinching. This wasn't a recitation, it was an indictment of the arrogance that had just belittled her, of the assumption that pedigree somehow diluted purpose. Jasmine wasn't just defending herself, she was exposing the lie at the core of Rosie's condescension. That experience behind a mic could rival experience inside a courtroom. And as she sat there, her voice low but unwavering, it became clear to everyone watching, Jasmine Crockett had just taken back the table. Not by matching Rosie's volume, but by bearing her narrative beneath the weight of lived truth. And after grounding the room in the weight of her lived experience, Jasmine's tone shifted, so subtly that Rosie didn't feel the change until it was already too late. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change her posture. But there was a new current in her words now, measured, unhurried, and unmistakably lethal. "Since we're talking about expertise," Jasmine said, her voice deceptively calm, "I'd like to address something that seems to have gone unchecked." She reached down beside her chair, retrieved a slim folder, and without drama, laid it flat on the table. Then she looked directly at Rosie and continued, "Just 3 weeks ago, you tweeted that the Criminal Justice Reform Act would reopen the door to federal mandates outlawed by the Supreme Court in 2011. That's not only incorrect, it's legally impossible." She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She simply let the falsehood speak for itself. In fact, the decision you referenced wasn't even related to sentencing reform. It dealt with administrative discretion in agency enforcement. The audience had gone still again, but this time, it wasn't in suspense. It was in realization. Jasmine wasn't just pointing out a mistake. She was stripping the illusion of credibility from someone who had weaponized it moments earlier. "And on your podcast last month," she added, turning a printed transcript toward the camera, "you said, quote, 'Federal judges don't influence prison terms anymore. It's all fixed by Congress.' Except that's not true. Judges retain discretion within federal guidelines, and your comments misrepresented not only the law, but its impact on actual human lives." By now, Rosie's expression had changed. The smirk was gone. Her eyes darted once, briefly, and her hands had stopped moving. She was still sitting upright, but the posture had shifted from dominance to defense. Yet she didn't fully realize it. Not yet, because Jasmine wasn't done. "You see," she said, locking eyes with her opponent, "when you speak from a platform, your words carry weight, even when they're wrong. And when you speak with authority on things you haven't studied, haven't practiced, and haven't lived, you don't just mislead, You erase the work of people trying to fix what you don't even understand. It was no longer about a single insult. Jasmine had elevated the conversation to a battlefield Rosie wasn't trained to survive on. She wasn't fighting back with personal jabs. She was burying the foundation under Rosie's entire argument. And with every citation, every sourced correction, every calm takedown of a flawed claim, she was drawing a clear line through the fog. There's a difference between having a voice and being qualified to use it. Rosie O'Donnell had confused the two, and Jasmine Crockett had just made sure the nation didn't. And as the room still buzzed from Jasmine's dismantling of Rosie's earlier misstatements, the Congresswoman made a movement so measured it felt rehearsed, not for effect, but for control. She reached down slowly, almost quietly, to the leather satchel beside her chair. The moment her fingers touched the flap, it felt less like a panel discussion and more like a courtroom cross-examination about to unfold. There was no fanfare, no flourish, just the clean sound of paper sliding against leather as she lifted a thick stack of documents and placed them neatly on the table in front of her. These weren't cue cards or flashy props. They were printed legal citations, government records, archived tweets, and annotated case law. Evidence, not commentary, not opinion, proof. She looked directly at Rosie, calm as ever, and spoke with a precision that cut through the tension like a scalpel through silk. "Since I'm being told that my education and experience aren't enough," she said, "I thought it might be useful to bring along some facts." She held up the first sheet, a printed tweet from Rosie dated just 8 weeks earlier, confidently declaring that state judges could overrule federal sentencing mandates in certain humanitarian circumstances. "That is legally false," Jasmine stated flatly. "State courts have no jurisdiction over federal sentencing guidelines. That's not a matter of debate. That's constitutional structure." No sarcasm, just truth. The second page was another tweet, this one posted after a House vote, claiming that the Miranda warning had been abolished for non-citizens. "That legislation was never written," Jasmine said. "Not proposed, not filed, not even imagined by the people you claim are pushing it." Then, without changing her cadence, she revealed a final document, an excerpt from a video interview Rosie had done, where she claimed the Constitution granted the president unilateral authority to suspend members of Congress during declared national emergencies. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't blink. "That power doesn't exist," she said. "It never has. That's not an interpretation. That's high school civics." There was no eruption, just a sharp collective inhalation, a tension shift you could feel in your spine. Then a stunned voice, maybe from the back row, whispered aloud, "She brought all of that?" And then another, clearer, firmer, "She studied for this." The applause that followed wasn't loud or chaotic. It was steady, deliberate, growing like the tide. It wasn't a celebration. It was recognition. The realization that Jasmine hadn't shown up to survive the segment. She'd shown up to expose what happens when arrogance meets preparation, when someone who spent decades mistaking visibility for expertise is finally held accountable. Not by outrage, but by the one force they never expect to answer to, the truth, on paper, in her hands. And as the sound of applause dissolved into a silence that gripped the room like a tightened fist, Jasmine Crockett sat motionless for half a beat, then leaned forward ever so slightly, closing the space between herself and the chaos Rosie had tried to stir. She no longer needed documents. She no longer needed proof. Everything that needed to be established had already been laid bare. Now came the part that separated the ones who talk from the ones who do. Her voice didn't rise, but the weight behind it dropped like iron through velvet. "Since you've made it clear you have concerns," she said, her tone even, surgical, and unmistakably final, "why don't you walk us through the section of the bill you believe is flawed? Not in generalities, specifically. Which provision, which paragraph, which legal precedent it contradicts." She paused, not to give Rosie space to recover, but to give the silence room to stretch and reveal what was missing. Any trace of substance on Rosie's end. The audience, now holding its collective breath, turned to watch Rosie, waiting for a response. But it didn't come. Rosie's eyes flickered, her mouth opened just slightly, But no answer followed. There was no section. There was no citation. Just the slow realization dawning across her face that she was being asked to stand on ground she had never taken the time to understand. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't mock. She didn't gloat. She simply let that absence speak louder than any argument Rosie could have made. Then, her gaze steady, she continued, her voice low, deliberate, and edged with the kind of clarity that comes from a life of having to prove what should already be obvious. Because I didn't come here to trade sound bites and insults. I didn't come here to perform. She leaned in just enough to make sure every word landed. I came here to legislate, to fix what people like you misunderstand from a distance, to write laws that outlive this noise. It wasn't just a line, it was a line in the sand. Rosie hadn't simply lost the argument, she had been disqualified from it, not by attack, but by invitation. And her silence in that moment said everything Jasmine didn't need to repeat. And as Jasmine's final declaration, I came here to legislate, settled over the room like a thunderclap that refused to echo. The silence that followed was no longer neutral. It had weight now. It had shape. It pressed against every corner of the studio, against the cameras, the monitors, the heartbeat of a live audience that realized they were no longer watching a political segment. They were witnessing a reckoning. Jasmine didn't flinch in the silence. She didn't shift. She let it sit, as if waiting to see if Rosie would try, even now, to claw back a fragment of authority. But nothing came. And in that stillness, Jasmine Crockett leaned in. Not for effect, not for drama, but to deliver the blow that had been sharpened across years of experience, years of being underestimated, interrupted, dismissed. This wasn't revenge, it was correction, a long overdue rebalancing. Her voice didn't rise. In fact, it dropped slightly, the way a final sentence does when a judge reads a ruling. Here's the reality, Rosie, she began, the name spoken without venom, but with something far colder, certainty. While you were composing tweets that misquoted laws and stirred outrage without substance, I was in committee hearings, writing real legislation that affects real people. The contrast hit like a gavel. While you were sitting behind a microphone, simplifying pain into punchlines, I was sitting beside defendants who didn't know if they'd see their children again. She paused, not to dramatize, but to let the distance between performance and purpose make itself clear. You crafted controversy for ratings. I crafted legal arguments to save people's lives. That's the difference. She didn't blink as she continued. When you were acting outrage for cameras, I was studying precedent, examining rulings, building frameworks that could withstand judicial scrutiny. I didn't memorize talking points, I authored them. Her gaze sharpened. And the truth is, every time you speak with certainty about systems you've never worked in, you make it harder for people like me, people who do the work, to be taken seriously. You drown truth in noise. You confuse attention with understanding. Then came the final stroke. Jasmine straightened her shoulders, not to assert power, but to stand in it. Her voice now carried not only calm, but momentum, something unstoppable and unmistakable. So let's be clear, she said, steady as steel. When you were writing tweets that misled millions, I was writing federal law. When you were performing outrage for applause, I was standing before judges defending human freedom. She paused again, just for a heartbeat, then delivered the sentence that shattered the studio. Experience without understanding is not wisdom. Her eyes locked onto Rosie one last time. It's noise. The words hit the studio like a sonic boom, silent at first, then explosive. For a half second, there was only stillness, as if the audience had to physically absorb what they had just heard. Then the dam broke. Applause erupted like a blast wave, raw, unscripted, and uncontrollable. People didn't just clap. They rose, they stood, they shouted. It wasn't polite affirmation. It was catharsis. A woman in the third row gasped, "Oh my God," clutching her chest. Someone else muttered under their breath, "That's it." She ended her. Another, louder voice said what everyone was thinking. She buried her alive. The audience no longer looked at Jasmine like a guest on a daytime segment. They looked at her like a storm that had swept through a room built on ego and left only truth standing. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't insulted. She had held a mirror to power, and the reflection was unforgiving. And Rosie didn't move. Her body stayed upright, but her face betrayed a slow collapse. The flush of humiliation bloomed across her cheeks. Her hands, once animated, were still. Her lips parted, then closed. She was no longer part of the conversation. She was its consequence. Jasmine, meanwhile, didn't acknowledge the applause. She didn't raise her hands, didn't nod, didn't smile. She remained composed, because this moment, to her, was never about performance. It was about accountability, about drawing the line where spectacle ends and service begins. Her eyes flicked downward to the next page in her folder, already preparing for whatever came next. Not because she needed to, but because that's what real public servants do. And in that moment, surrounded by thunderous applause, Jasmine Crockett had done more than win a debate. She had made a declaration to the nation. Respect doesn't come from visibility, it comes from the work. And if you confuse the two, expect to be corrected. And as Jasmine returned to her folder with that quiet, unshaken composure, unbothered by the storm she had just unleashed, the ripple effect was already building far beyond the studio. What had just happened wasn't a segment. It wasn't even a confrontation. It was an event. The kind of unscripted, unrehearsed moment that rips through the digital world like a match to dry brush. Within minutes, the clip began circulating. A 4-minute cut of Jasmine's closing remarks hit Twitter like an electric pulse. Then came the vertical format version for TikTok, split screen with Rosie's frozen expression, followed by the YouTube breakdowns, the Reddit threads, the Instagram reels quoting, "It's not wisdom, it's noise." The views didn't trickle in. They exploded. 10,000 in the first hour, 1 million before lunch. By sunset, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just trending. She was the trend. The phrase "Rosie got obliterated" climbed to the #2 spot on X, formerly Twitter, beaten only by Crockett 2028 ? And with every share, the fury grew. Not against Jasmine, but against everything Rosie's behavior had represented. Arrogance, entitlement, the weaponization of doubt toward accomplished women who didn't fit the old template. Commenters didn't hold back. This is what happens when someone confuses camera time with credibility. She thought it was a skit. Jasmine thought it was Congress. Guess who won? Others stitched the video with past Rosie soundbites, highlighting years of commentary now being re-examined in a far less flattering light. Rosie tried to respond, but too late, too shallow. She posted a vague apology. "Sometimes conversations get heated. I still believe in open dialogue." The backlash was immediate and brutal. Thousands of replies fired back like arrows. This wasn't a conversation. It was an ambush you lost. You questioned her education, then got schooled. Own it. The tweet was deleted within 90 minutes, but the screenshots were already viral. In the age of receipts, deletion was no erasure. The internet had a new favorite phrase: "You can delete the tweet, but not the defeat." It was etched into memes, printed on mock magazine covers, turned into a line of t-shirts within 24 hours. But the storm wasn't limited to social media. Legacy media moved in quickly, sensing the scale of what had happened. The Washington Post ran a full editorial under the headline, "Jasmine Crockett and the Power of Preparedness in the Age of Performance." In it, the columnist wrote, "What we witnessed on that stage wasn't just a political rebuttal, it was a surgical takedown of cultural condescension, a warning to every voice that mistakes volume for value." BBC World News aired a primetime segment titled "Words versus Work: How a U.S. Lawmaker Silenced a Celebrity with Nothing But Truth." They showed clips of Jasmine's remarks with live translation, and the anchor concluded, "Some debates don't need winners. They reveal frauds." Even CNN, often criticized for playing it safe, called it one of the most brutal intellectual takedowns ever broadcast on American daytime television. Within 48 hours, the term intellectual execution had entered the political lexicon. Professors weighed in. Communication experts posted breakdowns of Jasmine's body language, praising her stillness under pressure, her controlled pauses, her lethal timing. Law schools began circulating the footage internally. One dean from a top-tier institution tweeted, This is now required viewing for 1L trial advocacy. Even marketing executives started referencing the moment in corporate boardrooms, using it as a masterclass in handling live attacks without losing composure. And still, Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't tweet, didn't post, didn't take a victory lap because that wasn't the point. But Rosie couldn't retreat fast enough. Over the next few days, she canceled 3 public appearances, citing mental health space and the need for self-reflection. Publicists tried to reframe the narrative. A few sympathetic outlets attempted op-eds defending her passion or blaming editing choices, but it didn't land. The raw footage was everywhere. No context could explain away the sneer when she said sweetheart. No spin could undo the moment she was asked to cite law and sat there empty. The imbalance was visible now. Jasmine hadn't merely survived an attack. She had reframed what power looks like. In real time on live television, she had turned a one-sided ambush into a blueprint for resistance. Not with anger, but with intelligence. Not by shouting louder, but by standing firmer. And every person who'd ever been dismissed, talked over, condescended to, saw themselves in her composure. Rosie had brought personality. Jasmine brought proof. And the internet, the media, and the culture at large had already chosen which one of those mattered more. And as the media firestorm continued to escalate, clips looping on national television, academic panels dissecting Jasmine's composure frame by frame, and think pieces flooding every major outlet, something more substantial was happening behind closed doors on Capitol Hill. The headlines were loud, but the ripple effect was louder in the halls of Congress. The next morning, as the sun rose over Washington, D.C., Jasmine Crockett walked into her office not as a viral sensation, but as a lawmaker, one whose credibility had been forged not in spectacle, but in survival. She was met by an overflowing inbox, voicemails from staffers, text messages from colleagues, emails from legislative directors. But the most important notifications came with official seals and signatures. By 10:37 a.m., 5 more members of Congress had signed on as co-sponsors of her bill, the Criminal Justice Reform Act of 2024. By noon, the number had climbed to 11, and by the end of the day, the count stood at 23. Some were progressives who had always quietly admired her, waiting for a moment to step forward. Others were centrists who, just days before, had kept their distance, wary of attaching their names to something that challenged judicial norms too directly. But what Jasmine had done on national television wasn't just defend herself. It was prove her mastery over the very issues they were afraid to touch. One congressman from Pennsylvania said it plainly in an email to her chief of staff. She made the bill untouchable. After that performance, no one can say she doesn't know exactly what she's doing. The shift wasn't just procedural, it was personal. Inside offices that once saw her as ambitious but green, staffers now pulled up the clip of her line. When you wrote tweets, I wrote law, and played it during morning briefings like it was a rallying cry. The House Judiciary Committee's chairman, once lukewarm on the bill, sent a direct note. Let's schedule time this week. You've earned it. A senator's legislative aide leaked to Politico that Jasmine's hearing presence was being reassessed for upcoming sessions, not because she had gone viral, but because she had demonstrated something far rarer than charisma, unshakable command under pressure. And yet, even as the support grew, the contrast only deepened between what she had to endure and what she had to prove. Because Jasmine hadn't gotten those co-sponsors by asking. She hadn't made deals. She hadn't begged. She had earned every signature by walking into a rigged arena, being belittled on live television, and then surgically tearing down the very foundation of that attack using nothing but facts, preparation, and patience. Every yes that landed on her desk came not from political convenience, but from necessity. The moment was too public, the record too permanent. Saying no to her now wasn't just politically risky, it looked foolish. Inside the Capitol, her name was now said differently, not with hesitation, not with curiosity, with respect. One junior staffer was overheard in the elevator whispering to another, "That's Crockett's bill now. No one's going to challenge it after that." Another aide told a reporter off the record, "She turned public humiliation into legislative momentum. I've never seen anything like it." The hallway chatter had changed. Lawmakers who once second-guessed her credentials were now asking to be included in briefings. Offices that had once passed on joint statements now offered to write their own. Policy meetings that used to exclude her now shifted their time so she could attend. And Jasmine? She said nothing about it publicly. No press tour, no chest pounding, no celebrations. Because she knew exactly why the tide had shifted. It hadn't shifted because the bill suddenly made more sense. It hadn't shifted because justice had finally become fashionable. It had shifted because the spectacle had left no room for denial. In front of millions, Jasmine Crockett had been challenged, ridiculed, interrupted, and dismissed. And in the face of all of it, she didn't just respond, she commanded. And now those who once whispered doubts behind closed doors were racing to sign their names beside hers, because she hadn't just written a bill, she had made it impossible to ignore. And as Capitol Hill scrambled to realign itself around Jasmine Crockett's momentum, the aftershocks of her televised confrontation were already reshaping institutions far beyond the corridors of power. The clip had done more than spark a political response. It had carved out a blueprint, and nowhere was that felt more sharply than inside the walls of the nation's top law schools, where generations are shaped not by theory alone, but by example. Professors and deans, many of whom had watched the broadcast in disbelief, were the first to act. Within 48 hours of the broadcast, the video had been downloaded, clipped, and inserted into advocacy and litigation syllabi. The footage wasn't just recommended viewing, it became curriculum. At Harvard Law, her alma mater, a renowned professor paused mid-lecture on appellate advocacy and said, "We were going to study a mock cross-examination today. Instead, we're going to study reality." He dimmed the lights. The projector whirred, and the room fell silent as Jasmine's calm, composed voice filled the screen. She wasn't standing at a podium. She wasn't holding a gavel. She was seated, firm, unshaken under fire, and yet dismantling misinformation with surgical precision. When the video reached her line, "When you were tweeting lies, I was writing law," no one in the lecture hall moved. A second-year student whispered, "That's what I want to be able to do." At New York University, the video was brought into a seminar on high-pressure communications. A guest lecturer from a major civil rights firm paused the clip after Jasmine asked Rosie to cite a statute. "That's the moment," he said. "Right there. That's silence. That's control. You don't shout. You don't rush. You wait, because you've already won." Students furiously took notes, not on theory, but on rhythm, posture, tone. They watched how Jasmine never flinched, never lost eye contact, how her language never became personal, even as she was being personally attacked. It wasn't just law, it was discipline in motion. Georgetown Law created a discussion module around the segment, framing it as the real-time ethics of public advocacy. The conversation shifted beyond Jasmine's performance and into what it represented. What it means for a Black woman to defend not only her work, but her right to speak in a space that was designed to discredit her. One student raised her hand and said, if she had raised her voice, even once, she would have been branded angry. But because she stayed calm, she obliterated the room. Why should she have to walk that tightrope? The professor responded without blinking. Because power still comes with double standards. But what she showed is how to burn the rope while standing on it. Even at smaller regional law schools, the clip was introduced not for the fame, but for the lesson. A trial advocacy instructor in Detroit said, "We've studied Kennedy. We've studied Thurgood Marshall. But this is what courtroom command looks like in the digital age. No robes, no gavels, just facts under fire." Students watched, captivated. Some nodded. Some sat motionless. All of them saw not a politician, but a technician, a tactician, a woman who knew how to handle a hostile cross, not in theory, but in practice. On live television, no edits, no moderator, just raw confrontation. And yet behind every analysis was a deeper current of recognition. Jasmine had been forced into that moment. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't provoked it. She had been challenged, her degree, her intelligence, her legitimacy, all under the guise of conversation. What law schools now dissected as brilliance had, in real time, been triggered by condescension and bias. And still, she hadn't just held the line. She rewrote where the line was. At Stanford, a professor of legal rhetoric assigned an essay, "When Law Becomes Language, Analyze How Congresswoman Crockett Reframed Power Using Only Structure, Tone, and Content." One student wrote, "She never once called Rosie a liar. She didn't need to. She let the truth do it for her." Another wrote, "She changed the rules of engagement without ever announcing it." That's not just advocacy, that's transformation. Law deans began to circulate internal memos recommending the clip be integrated into first-year moot court programs, not as a debate strategy, but as an example of poise under provocation. The American Bar Association sent a short-form newsletter titled "The Crockett Moment: Why Professionalism Still Wins." In it, they wrote, "Congresswoman Crockett's conduct on live television was not only legally sound, it was strategically flawless. Her restraint in the face of mockery, her clarity under pressure, and her unwavering control offer a masterclass for every young litigator preparing to walk into a room where they might not be welcomed." And Jasmine, she didn't tweet about it. She didn't retweet a single law school clip or media headline. She gave no interviews. She declined every offer to speak on panels titled "Powerful Women in Politics" or "How to Go Viral with Grace." Because Jasmine hadn't intended to teach a lesson, she had been forced to defend her right to speak in a space that wanted to reduce her to a punchline. But now across lecture halls and legal writing labs, her voice echoed louder than any textbook. Not because she raised it, but because she refused to lower it. And as law schools canonized the moment and legal institutions adopted Jasmine's voice as a new standard, the outside world, faster, colder, less forgiving, began to make its judgments too. The consequences came not as a headline, but as a whisper that turned into a roar. Rosie O'Donnell lost her deal. It began with murmurs inside the network, internal review meetings behind glass doors, urgent calls between executives. There was no formal announcement, no press conference, just a sudden removal of her image from upcoming promos, a canceled media appearance due to scheduling, and then the final blow, a leaked internal memo from the production company confirming her contract would not be renewed. The language was sterile, procedural, but everyone knew what it meant. The backlash was too strong, too swift, too righteous. What Rosie had delivered was not entertainment, it was elitism weaponized, mockery dressed as dialogue. And audiences, many of whom had grown weary of power disguised as sarcasm, turned on her not because she was cruel, but because she was wrong. By the third day after the broadcast, sponsors had quietly begun pulling ads. One brand released a vague statement about values no longer aligning. Online petitions gained over 100,000 signatures overnight. Influencers across the spectrum, legal, academic, political, and even entertainment, posted side-by-side comparisons. Rosie's scoff beside Jasmine's calm rebuttal. Hashtags exploded. The Crockett effect trended for 72 hours straight. But it wasn't about cancellation, it was about clarity. A public reckoning had taken place in real time, and no amount of late-night damage control could undo the weight of Rosie's contempt or the precision of Jasmine's dignity. And while Rosie's empire buckled under the weight of her own misstep, Jasmine Crockett stood, unshaken, unbought, and now, undeniably unforgettable. The image of her seated, composed, delivering that final sentence, "Next time you question a woman's intelligence, make sure you're qualified to have that conversation," was clipped and shared millions of times. It became a rallying cry, printed on t-shirts, painted on protest signs, projected on billboards from Atlanta to Los Angeles. It wasn't just a mic drop. It was a battle standard for every woman who had ever been interrupted, belittled, or told to smile more. Media outlets that once treated Jasmine as a rising figure now hailed her as something greater, an icon forged not in triumph but in fire. Time magazine called her the voice of a generation trained to dismantle power with facts, not fury. The New Yorker ran a full spread titled "Poise as Power: How Jasmine Crockett Redefined Public Debate." A Wall Street Journal op-ed, surprisingly sympathetic, wrote, "You don't have to agree with her politics to respect her command of the moment. And if you can't respect that, you don't belong in the room." But perhaps the most powerful shift wasn't in the newsrooms or trending tags. It was in the conversations happening at kitchen tables, on classroom floors, in boardrooms where women had grown used to nodding through disrespect. Now when someone was cut off mid-sentence, a voice might rise in quiet solidarity. Make sure you're qualified to have that conversation. It was Jasmine's line, but it no longer belonged to her alone. It belonged to every woman who had waited for her turn to speak, only to be told her expertise was too emotional, too loud, too complex, too much. And Jasmine? She didn't bask in it. She didn't campaign on it. She went back to work, drafting legislation, meeting with union leaders, fighting for bills that rarely made the front page. But something had changed. When she entered a hearing now, people listened faster. When she paused mid-sentence, they waited. When she cited a statute, no one rolled their eyes. Her presence, once underestimated, was now quietly mythologized. Because she hadn't just won a debate. She had exposed something deeper, a system still wired to doubt women who came prepared, to mock confidence as arrogance, and to treat intelligence like a threat, unless it came from the right face, with the right tone, in the right suit. Jasmine never adjusted to fit that mold. She broke it, and the sound of it cracking, that was the applause. In the quiet aftermath, while Rosie disappeared from front pages and Jasmine rose into them, the cultural shift remained. One moment, sharp, concise, undeniable, had become a compass. And though the cameras had stopped rolling and the applause had faded, the words lived on in echo. Next time you question a woman's intelligence, make sure you're qualified to have that conversation. And the world finally listened. And as the dust settled, not in silence, but in the quiet churn of a culture forever shifted, there came something far more powerful than vindication. A lesson, not printed on front pages or stitched into viral tweets, but buried in the trembling pause before Jasmine spoke, in the eyes of every viewer who recognized themselves in her restraint, in her clarity, in her refusal to return cruelty with chaos. That moment had started as a public ambush, but what emerged was a parable about dignity in the face of calculated humiliation. A lesson not just about winning, but about how we win and who gets told they're not allowed to. Because Jasmine Crockett had not just defended herself. She had redefined what it looks like when a Black woman walks into a room filled with doubt and instead of shrinking, decides to teach. She did not raise her voice, she raised the bar. And in doing so, she exposed something deeper than Rosie's arrogance. She laid bare the scaffolding of a system that still whispers, "You don't belong here," no matter how many degrees, how many laws written, how many hours prepared. Jasmine didn't just confront the insult. She metabolized it, transformed it, and handed it back as a mirror. The real lesson wasn't that Rosie fell. It was that Jasmine never needed to push. What shook viewers to their core wasn't just the power of Jasmine's argument. It was the restraint she showed in delivering it. That calm, that stillness, that readiness. It reminded everyone watching of the silent burdens carried by people who are forced to earn every inch of respect, again and again, in rooms where others are handed it by default. It was the reminder that some are born into conversations, while others have to fight just to be heard in them. And in that studio, on that day, Jasmine didn't just demand to be heard, she made listening unavoidable. What the world saw wasn't just a woman standing her ground, it was a woman carrying generations of inherited dismissal and refusing to flinch. Every time she waited, every time she didn't interrupt Rosie, every time she responded not with rage but with receipts, she became a symbol of something far bigger than politics. She became the embodiment of what happens when knowledge becomes armor, when grace becomes resistance, and when being underestimated becomes a tactical advantage. But perhaps the most human part of it all was this. Jasmine didn't fight for applause. She wasn't interested in takedowns. She fought because she knew what was at stake wasn't her ego. It was the precedent. The millions of girls watching who'd been called sweetheart in meetings they ran. The countless professionals told they were too aggressive while watching mediocrity promoted. The sons and daughters of working-class families who grew up knowing they'd have to be twice as good to get half as far. Jasmine didn't speak just for herself. She spoke because someone had to break the cycle. And that is the lesson that burned brightest long after the headlines faded. That silence, when chosen, can be more powerful than any scream. That facts, when wielded with precision, can pierce through arrogance like a scalpel through armor. And that respect, true respect, isn't earned through volume or tenure or legacy. It's earned through clarity, through preparation, through refusing to perform rage and instead commanding presence. But the real heartbreak, the real drama, was not that Rosie underestimated Jasmine. It was that the world expected Jasmine to take it, to laugh it off, to play along. That's what made her defiance so surgical. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, it was measured. And that precision, that discipline, is what crushed the old narrative and forced a new one to the surface. One that no longer asked women like Jasmine to prove their worth, but finally began asking why they were ever doubted in the first place. She taught us that sometimes the most radical act is not to shout, but to show. That the most unforgettable moments in history are not made by those who speak first, but by those who speak right. And that in a world so quick to reward spectacle, there is still unmatched power in a truth calmly, irrefutably delivered. And for every person who had ever been spoken over, misnamed, talked down to, or dismissed for being too smart, or too serious, or too prepared, this was not just a moment of catharsis. It was a signal, a confirmation that the tides are shifting. That composure is not weakness. That precision is not arrogance. That you were never too much. They were simply not enough. Jasmine Crockett didn't win that day because she was the loudest. She won because she was undeniable. Because when truth and dignity stand side by side, no insult, no matter how rehearsed or smug, can survive their shadow. And that's the lesson the world now carries forward, engraved not in law, but in memory. When you walk into a room that was never built for you, don't ask for space. Emotions still hung in the air like smoke from a cannon blast. Raw, metallic, unforgettable. But Jasmine didn't step back. She stepped forward. Her voice, though calm, struck with the sharpness of steel on stone. "Let me be clear," she said, locking eyes with the camera, as if daring the nation to look away. "This isn't about me winning a debate. This is about who gets to speak truth and who gets silenced for it, about who gets labeled angry or naive for daring to demand justice." The crowd leaned in, not just those in the studio, but millions watching from living rooms, classrooms, break rooms, from every place where the voiceless had ever been told to sit down and wait their turn. Jasmine's gaze swept across the lens like it was a courtroom, and the jury was every viewer still undecided. "You've seen what happens when power feels threatened by knowledge," she continued. "When a woman of color walks into a space not built for her and doesn't just survive, but rewrites the damn blueprint. You've heard the laughter. You've felt the silence. But now I'm asking you not to just feel, I'm asking you to move." Her tone didn't beg, it commanded, not with arrogance, but with urgency carved from experience. If you've ever been told you're too much, too loud, or not ready, then this moment belongs to you. This bill, this fight, this future, it's not mine alone. It's yours. So don't clap for me. Call your representative. Flood their phones. Show up. Speak out. Because justice doesn't happen when one voice shouts. It happens when millions refuse to whisper. There was no music swelling beneath her word. No dramatic camera pan. Just truth. Delivered like a match thrown on gasoline. And in that instant, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman or a lawyer. She became something else entirely. Trigger, a reckoning. A call to every teacher tired of underfunded classrooms, every mother afraid of a broken justice system swallowing her child whole, every worker told they're lucky just to have a job. She spoke, and the silence shattered, not with noise, but with momentum. A movement didn't begin that night, it accelerated. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.